Hi, I'm Amy Cardoso, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and our interviewer, Estibalíz García, speaks with curator Gary Tinterow about the exhibition Degas, A New Vision. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, we're here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston with Gary Tinterow to talk about their latest exhibition, Degas, A New Vision. Gary, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
So can you please briefly tell us about the exhibition?
The exhibition is about 224 works by Degas, one of the great artists in the history of European painting. He lived in the second half of the 19th century, and we treat his entire career from his young studies when he was a teenager until the very last works that we think he made around 1910. And it includes all media, paintings, drawings, printmaking, monotypes, even sculpture.
It's very important to talk about the man behind the art. So tell us about his early life. He comes from a very privileged family and his education in Louis Le Grand. Can you tell us more about that?
Edgar Degas was a very lucky young man. He grew up in an affluent household. His father was a private banker. His father was Italian French and his mother was American French, and she called herself a Creole. Her name was Mousson. She came from New Orleans. Her family came from New Orleans. But she died when he was 14. And his father took charge of Edgar's education. He was the eldest of 5 children. And he had the best possible education at the time. He went to the best high school in Paris. He learned to read Greek and Latin, to write it. He knew French literature. He knew even Shakespeare. And he had that important classical formation when he arrived as a young art student in Rome in the late 1850s. And there he acted like a traditional art student sponsored by the state, but in fact, because he came from an affluent family, he was sponsored by his father.
Okay.
But he did the normal things. He drew the beggars in the street. He went to the Académie de France and he drew from live models. He studied the old masters at the Uffizi, at the Vatican, and the various chapels of Italy. And he looked at the great Renaissance masters, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and learned a great deal from them.
Okay, so he spends almost 3 years in Italy. What happens upon his return to Paris? What kind of art scene does he come to during this time?
Well, a very vibrant art scene, and in the 1860s with the Second Empire and the big economic, ultimately became a balloon, but the sort of economic rush of Paris in the 1860s, and he participates in that, and he also participates in the development of the art market of the modern art market in most senses of the term. And he begins to conceive works both for French private collectors, but also he has his eye on the English market. And he sees through his friends, Whistler and Fontaine-Latour, and most importantly, James Jacques Tissot, that there was a real market for his work in England, and that he could profit from it. And so we see early on in the 1860s and the early 1870s him working almost in 2 styles, one for the English market and one for the French market. The English market much more narrative with many details and a kind of precisionist painting. And for those works for the French market, more brushwork, more art historical allusions, you might say a more sophisticated taste, less finish, more content.
And during this time, he decides to finally enter a piece at the Salon of 1865, the war scene?
Yeah, he exhibits only, in 65, 66, 67. And those pieces that he shows, I mean, the scene of war of the Middle Ages is so important because it establishes some of the important themes and also gestures and characters that we see later in his life. So the theme is really the conflict between the sexes, and in this case we have soldiers, medieval soldiers, taking women away from the village. The village is in flames.
Okay, so he comes having family in New Orleans. He comes here for a few months. What is his focus around this time?
Well, he comes to visit his uncle Michel Mousson's family and his cousins, and he was. It's interesting how affectionate and playful he was with all of his cousins. And he never married, he never had children, but in so many ways, Degas seems like a family man, more than many people I know. He was deeply interested in the lives of his brothers and sisters and of their children. And so, on the one hand, he rejoiced in the comfort of the family in New Orleans. He was fascinated by his Uncle Michel Mousson's cotton exchange, and he did this extraordinary painting with portraits of 14 individuals engaged in work. I always like to point out that the three Frenchmen in the painting aren't working, and all the Americans are working very hard. His two brothers, Achille and René, and then his Uncle Michel. Clearly he missed the sophisticated cultural offerings of Paris when he was in New Orleans. He also was beginning to experience his first problems with his eyes, and he felt that the strong light of New Orleans was actually painful to him. And eventually he had some kind of hemorrhage or problem with his retinas, and if you know what floaters are, he had severe case of floaters. Sometimes he said it was like looking through a colander, and that was at the end of his life. But New Orleans was an important adventure for him because it solidified for him what was important about Paris. And when he returned to Paris, he then began to focus on music and dance, as well as jockey scenes, as the next stage of his career.
Yes, that's very important. He started painting scenes of jockeys at Longchamp around 1860.
Well, no, there are a few, we see some horses already in his copies after the Old Masters, and then we see him going to visit his friend Valpinçon in Normandy, who lived near a famous stud farm for racehorses, the Haras du Pin. And it was in the mid-60s and late 1860s that he begins to paint his first racecourse scenes. But of course, in his salon submission, the portrait of Mademoiselle Eugénie Fiocre, there's a horse there. It was a funny ballet based in ancient Assyria, and there's a horse drinking from a spring. So horses are there from the beginning.
So 1874, tell us about the Impressionist exhibition, the Batignolles group, or as we can say, the anti-salon exhibition.
Yeah. Well, Degas had three submissions to the Salon in 65, 66, 67. None of them was a success, although we esteem those paintings highly now. But it didn't bring to him the fame or even the notoriety that he saw his friend Edward Manet receive, that he saw the older and more established contrarian Gustave Courbet receive. And so after the Franco-Prussian War and in the aftermath of an economy that was literally busted, he and a group of artists, Monet, Pissarro, others, got together and created this independent exhibition society we now call the Impressionist exhibitions, and they exhibited either every year, every 2 years from 1874 to 1886. And that became the primary vehicle for Degas to exhibit his work, sell his works, become known. And then he withdrew from that after 1886 and only exhibited a few times after that. Degas always had a slightly difficult relationship with his peers. He sometimes was competitive with them, sometimes he was dismissive of their efforts. He never fully endorsed the Impressionist aesthetic of capturing a moment in the landscape and rendering it on canvas. He was much interested instead in human psychology, human interaction, human figure painting.
And let's talk about his later work. As we can see over here, he starts focusing more on nudes and on bathers. And instead of painting, he goes on to pastels on paper. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, his shift in media, sometimes it's just a new enthusiasm, and sometimes it's a reflection of an economic necessity. So when his father died in 1874, and at the depth of the French economy, he realized, or he and his brothers realized, that the father's bank was bankrupt, that the guarantees they had on their loans were no longer, or the investments that they had made were insufficient to cover the reserves necessary. And so he had to repay debt that his father had incurred. And that therefore meant that he had to sell works of art. And he discovered that he could work more quickly in pastel than in oil paint. He also discovered that he could, with monotypes, which is a kind of finger painting on a printing plate, and you print it, you could make 2 or 3 out of each of those very informal and quick gestures, not having to put the plate in the acid bath if it were an etching, not having to go through the laborious method of an engraving. It was a way to make prints quickly, and then he found that he could pastelize them, color them with pastel, that he had something to start with, and then he could make a variant. And that was the beginning of what becomes his habitual technique, which is to start with something that he had already made, and then to revise it, and to make variants. And that is a very modern technique. It's what Matisse used, it's what Picasso used, it's what Jasper Johns used. You know, you start with something, you make it, and you remake it again. And that is why I think he's one of the early progenitors of modernism, because of his because his emphasis on technique and the restriction of his work to a few chosen motifs and subjects, and then constantly reworking in that vein for 30 or 40 years.
You refer to him as the first modern artist. And in curating this exhibition, what are your final thoughts, seeing all this work put together?
Yeah, I'm absolutely persuaded that Degas is one of the greatest artists who ever lived in Europe, and his method became the method of many modern artists of the 20th century. And so for that reason, I see him as an early modernist, a progenitor of the modernist aesthetic in his work. We also see him at the very end of his life. It's wrong to say that he was anticipating, because he wasn't deliberately anticipating, like, I'm going to discover this before you, Picasso and Matisse. But what we see him is creating an expressive style, like the works behind me here, that is something that Picasso and Matisse were striving for, but Degas had already achieved it 5, 10, 15 years before they had achieved it for themselves. And we know that Matisse and Picasso, as young men, were aware of Degas' work. There were only a few places that you could see them, but one of them was Volar's gallery, and they were both exhibiting with Volar, and Degas was buying works by Degas, and he had them, if not on exhibition, in the back, where the artist would meet with the dealer. So there were a few publications also where Degas' work, most recent work, his late work, his expressive work, was visible to young artists. So he's very much part of this continuum, this story of modernism, where we see how certain stylistic impulses are carried from one generation to the next. And he is absolutely one of the big men in that generation.
One last question before we leave. His own work was discovered after his death. Can you tell us about that?
There were only a few publications in the 20th century while he was still alive that showed his recent work. Volar published one album, and there was a group of drawings that he had selected from his art that was published by someone else in beautiful reproductions. Those were studied by artists, and that was one way that his work became known. But after his death in 1917, and the sales that were held at the end of the First World War in Paris released thousands of works of art. Studies, of course, that he never intended to sell or even to be seen by the public, his own private studies, his trove of drawings, his trove of tracings that he made of his own work and helped in order to generate new work. All of his models in clay and wax, which were cast after his death by his heirs, all that became known. And it took a while, but it finally sunk in, first in the big exhibition in the 1930s, and then after the Second World War. What an extraordinary artist he was. And as our own art changes and our taste changes, I think when we look back at Degas' work, we're never disappointed. We can marvel at the precision of his early work. We can be astounded by the emotional veracity of his late work. The violence of his stroke at the end of his life, the unusual color combinations, which had never before been seen in art, are truly extraordinary, and they remain fresh. So he's an artist, I find, who doesn't age. And and that must be because of his modernity. He lived at the same time as a beautiful artist whose exhibition we had last summer, Winterhalter, who portrayed all the great royal houses of Europe. That was from another epoch. And his art, though extraordinary and beautiful, is from another world, a world that we no longer inhabit. But I feel that Degas' work tells me something about the world in which I live today. It tells me about human invention, creativity, human psychology. And so that's never going to go away. And I think that that's a strong indicator that Degas has something to tell many future generations.
Well, what a marvelous story and even a more marvelous exhibition. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
We want to thank Gary for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to mfah.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.